Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is going to be about just functions, how functions work, and chaining functions. So first let's talk about just how do you write a function. So there's three ways to write a function, okay? Sort of the oldest way to write a function is you would use the function keyword. So I would say function keyword, the name of my function, my func, and then what you do is you put in a parentheses. The parentheses is where you put parameters. These are like placeholder variables. Because what's going to happen is that whoever uses the function is able to pass data into the function. But you do not know what data they're going to pass in. So you're going to put like a label that represents the data that will eventually come in. Generally, you want to give it a label that kind of represents what it is. Makes it easier to read your function. But here we're just going to say a value. So you can pass in a value to this function. Then you would do curly brackets, and then you can do whatever you want in this function. And then at the end, you can return a value. Okay, so I'm just going to return value. Okay, and then I'm also going to console.log the value because I want to make a point about that. And again, remember, console log is just a debugging tool. It doesn't actually do anything. Okay, so if I took out the return for the moment, save, what is the value of my func? So if I were to console.log my func 5, you're thinking, okay, well, the value of my function should be 5, but it isn't because I don't return anything. So this function never gives me anything back. It will console log the value 5, but watch what happens. Node testing.js, and see, it console logs 5, but that's because the function does it inside the function. But this console log only ends up console logging undefined because it's waiting for the function to give it something back, and it never does. Okay, so basically this is just the equivalent of me putting undefined in the parentheses. Okay, a function will always execute the code in the function. That's the benefit of functions. That way I don't have to do something over and over again. But generally, you want it to return a value. So really what I wanted to do is to return the value. So now, when I return the value, you're only going to see one console log, and it's going to be 5. Because this function runs, it gives it back the 5. And the cool thing is, you can treat this chunk of code here as if it were that returned value. So this is literally 5. So if I were to do this, 5 plus my func 6, it's the equivalent of 5 plus 6, because technically this is going to return 5. This is going to return 6, because the way this works, this is called an argument. So I'm passing 5 in as an argument. It goes into the function, takes the first argument, and plops it into the first placeholder, the first parameter. And then the function just says, this is now 5, this is now 5, returns 5. So basically, this is going to return 5, this is going to return 6, so this is literally the same thing as 5 plus 6. So you always want to kind of think of a function as its return value. Like, what is this? It's the return value. So you need to know what a function returns, because that's essentially what the variable is. Okay? So that's the basic concept of like how a function works. But this is not the only way to write a function. You could also do this. The second way to write a function is like this. I could go equals function. So in this case, I put a variable and say const my func equals function value parentheses. Okay, and then I'll just do my func 5 just to show you it's still working. And see, it's still working. Okay, cool. And then the newest way to write a function is you would just take out the word function, which saves you some space. Save. And this is called an arrow function. So you see, you start off with the parentheses with your parameters, then you put this little arrow, and then you put your function instructions. And you still save it in a variable. So you're just saying, hey, save this function in this variable. That's literally all that's going on here. And if I run it, it still works. Although this one is unique. Okay, this one is unique. See, with the other two function syntax, you had something called, basically old school JavaScript, what they did is that your functions always had this object attached to it. Arrow functions do not. The object was referred to as a prototype. Okay, so the function had this dual use. So I could be like const myfunc equals, and we'll just say name, and I was able to use this keyword because since there's this object attached to the function, I can assign properties to that object. So I could be like this.name equals name, and if this looks very familiar to classes, then that's exactly what this is. Okay, I could write a function. I could be like this dot my method equals console.log hello. Okay, so I could do this, all these add, and then basically whenever I use this, what it was referring to is the function's prototype, its attached prototype. Okay, which is just weird. Okay, but what does that mean? It means I could do this. Const Alex equals a new myfunc Alex. Okay, and if that looks a lot like classes, it's because it is. Okay, literally classes are just basically this aspect of a function separated, and then the actual function part of the function got separated into an arrow function. So that way, instead of having this one thing that does everything and is very confusing, you have two things that do separate things and are less confusing. So you could do this. Okay, you can't do that with arrow functions. Arrow functions do not have that capability, which is not a bad thing. It keeps things simple. If you want to do something like this, you use classes, and if you wanted to do something like we were doing before, you could use an arrow function. This way, the two are sort of separate concepts and are less confusing. Okay, and this is when you use a function like this, it's referred to as a constructor function because it's being used to construct an object. So essentially, what's really going on in JavaScript, when you use the new keyword, it says, hey, this function has a prototype. You're going to create me a new object, which we're going to store in the variable Alex, and it's going to have this my function, whatever prototype's attached to it, that's going to be the prototype of this new object that we're going to store in Alex. Okay, so that's how that works. Again, to keep it simple, I would just use classes and arrow functions. But the reason I bring this up is because chaining. Okay, so you've probably seen people do stuff like this, where like, let's say we have a string. Okay, const I am Alex, and then I want to split this string, so I'm going to do split the string, and I'm going to split it by each word. Okay, and I'm going to console log the results here, so that way you guys can see. Okay, console.log. So this is a string. I go dot split. I'm going to split it by each space, but that gives me back an array of I am Alex. So that array, I would like to, let's say, what would I do with the array? Let's reverse the array. Okay, and then when I reverse the array, I want to turn the array back into a string, so I join it. Okay, and then that's it. We're going to console log it, so I'll reverse the string. Now, how am I able to do this, and how am I supposed to know that I can do this? The reason why this is possible is because of prototypes. So strings have a prototype. There's a prototype that's already pre-built into JavaScript. Okay, and it has all these functions already added to it. So kind of like in the same way you would add functions to a class, there's already all these functions on the string prototype. So long as this is a string, you can then use dot notation to access that method. Now this returns an array, and an array has a prototype with a bunch of methods on it, such as reverse. So since this resolves, since this returns an array, I can then do dot and then access that property. And then since this still returns an array, because reverse returns an array, I can still then again use dot join, which is another array function that combines the array back into a string. Okay. And then this basically says, so basically this says split it, wherever there's a space. So this becomes I am Alex. Join says when you join the array back together, every time you go to another element, put a space in between them. So then it becomes I, put a space, am, space, Alex. Except I reversed it, so it's going to be in the wrong order. So it's going to be Alex, space, am, space, I. And let's just actually confirm that real quick. See? It reversed the string. Okay? Because first it split it up into an array, then it reversed the array, and then it joined the string together. But again, I could only do that chaining by knowing what methods are on the prototype of that thing. So I have to know what are string methods, what are array methods, and what do each of these things return. Because if I tried to do another string method on this, it's not going to work because split returns an array. So I can only use array methods for the next step in the chain. But what if I want to add my own method? Okay, so at the end we have a string again. If I wanted to add like a string method or a string property, I could do you could do it. You just do, I always forget, I think it's going to be string, I think uppercase. I just forget if it's uppercase or lowercase. String.prototype. And now you can actually add stuff to that prototype for that array, for the string, for objects. Well, not objects, that's a whole other conversation. But let's say I want to add a property called cheese. Okay, so I'm adding it to a string prototype, which means now all strings will have this thing. String prototype equals 6. Save. So now, since join returns a string, I could do this, and it'll access the cheese property, which just equals the number 6. So it's why you would never do that, but just so to show you that it works. And see, I got the property 6 because by adding to the string prototype, that makes it accessible to all strings. So you could create your own array methods. You can create your own string methods. You just have to add them to the prototype. So you'd have to do like, you would create like a function. You know, if I did this, like, console.log hello. Okay, and then return 5. So when this function runs, it's going to console.log hello, and then return 5, which is this cheese function here. So I have to turn that into a function now and invoke it. And see, the cheese runs, it console logged hello, then returned 5, which is what ends up being the console log here. Because again, the console log is going to return what this whole statement resolves to. Okay. Yeah. So again, 2 points with chaining is you need to know what each function returns, because you can only chain methods of the prototype of the return value. So you can chain array, string methods, object methods if it returns an object. So if you don't know what those methods are, although there really isn't many object methods. It really just is like array and string methods. So you could do a lot of bouncing back between arrays and strings and doing a lot of fun stuff. But that's all chaining is. You're just saying, hey, this function, again, I have a string. I'm going to split it. Split returns an array. I'm going to reverse it. Reverse returns an array. I'm going to join it back together. And then here I just added this random function cheese that I added as part of the prototype in case you want to add your own array or string methods built into strings. And the only benefit of that is that you can chain them. That's the benefit of adding things to the prototype. Because if I wrote my own function, I'd have to write it on a separate line. Because it's not built into the string or array, so I can't chain off of it. Because again, all you're doing when you hit dot, again, all the dot is doing is saying I'm calling the property of. So then since this is a string, all strings have split as a property. So I'm just saying, hey, I'm accessing the split property of this array. I mean, of this string. And since this returns an array, all arrays have reverse as a property. So I can call reverse. And since this returns an array, all arrays have join as a property because they're all built into the prototype. So I know I'm saying this over and over again. I'm just trying to really sink this idea in there so you can understand what's going on when you chain a function. All you're doing is you're using dot notation in the same way you use anything else. You're accessing the property of a piece of data. And once you appreciate that, chaining things becomes just more obvious in a lot of situations, like when you can and when you can't. And it becomes more important to really kind of understand when you use a function, what does that function return? What does it give it back to me? Maybe I know what it does, but I really need to appreciate what does the function return. How do you know that? Read the documentation. So that was kind of a heavy duty lesson and kind of the ins and outs of functions. And again, functions can do all sorts of things. You know, you can return any kind of value with functions. You can take in as many parameters as you want. So you can have a lot of fun with functions, and they can do a lot of things. This isn't meant to be quite as crazy as some of my previous videos about functions. So hopefully this gives you a nice overview, plus some extra new stuff, some new juice on how functions work.